If advanced beings visited Earth, then the strangest detail is not that they came, it is that their stories keep repeating, across continents that never met, across cultures separated by oceans, across centuries with no shared language. The same figures return, the same actions unfold, the same departures are recorded, and they do so with an unsettling precision that feels less like myth and more like memory. This is where our story begins, not with a declaration, not with a conclusion, but with a quiet question. If these accounts were only imagination, why do they follow patterns that appear again and again, independent of time and place? And if they were real, why do they seem to come and go in cycles? Before we move any further, take a moment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Are you lying awake in the quiet hours, resting after a long day, or listening as the world slowly fades into sleep? I read every message, and knowing where these stories travel helps shape the ones that come next. Now let the noise of the present soften. Let the pace of the day release its grip, and allow your attention to drift, not forward, but backward, into a time before written history knew it was being written. In recent years, a name has surfaced repeatedly in discussions of ancient anomalies and modern observation systems. 3I Atlas. For many, it has become a symbol, sometimes a misunderstood one, of humanity's attempt to monitor, categorize, and predict patterns that lie beyond ordinary perception. Officially, it is a system designed to observe movements, signals, and anomalies that might otherwise go unnoticed. But unofficially, it has taken on a much heavier role in public imagination. It has become a lens, a way of interpreting ancient stories through a modern framework. In this interpretation, the narrative often becomes simplified. One visitor, one arrival, one intervention, a single non-human intelligence interacting with early humanity. This idea is appealing because it is clean. It fits neatly into a linear story. Something arrived, something happened, and then it left. But ancient records are rarely linear, and this is where the first tension appears. When researchers compare mythologies from Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, the Indus Valley, ancient China and the Pacific, something becomes immediately apparent. They are not describing the same event, they are describing the same pattern, a pattern that repeats. Figures arrive from the sky or from beneath the earth. They teach, alter, or reorganize human life. They establish order, laws, or knowledge. And then, without warning, they withdraw, sometimes peacefully, sometimes abruptly, sometimes following catastrophe. Then centuries pass, and the pattern begins again. This repetition is not occasional, it is structural. The limitation of the single entity interpretation becomes obvious here. A lone visitor does not explain why civilizations thousands of years apart describe similar arrivals separated by long intervals of absence, nor does it explain why the descriptions evolve while retaining a core framework. If the stories were copied, we would expect consistency in detail. Instead, we see consistency in sequence. This distinction matters because sequence is how memory organizes reality. Some scholars argue that these similarities are the result of shared psychological archetypes. Others point to convergent myth-making, humans independently inventing similar stories to explain natural forces. These explanations are not unreasonable, but they leave something unanswered. Why do these myths emphasize timing? Why do they describe return? Why do they speak of cycles instead of permanence? Ancient texts are remarkably specific about this. In Sumerian literature, the Anunnaki do not rule indefinitely. They arrive, govern, depart, and later return in altered form. In Mesoamerican traditions, the gods of previous ages leave after each world cycle ends, only to reappear under new names in the next era. In Hindu cosmology, devas and higher beings operate within repeating yugas, vast cycles of time that reset conditions again and again. In ancient China, the mandate of heaven is not eternal. It is granted, withdrawn, and restored in cycles tied to moral and environmental balance. These are not stories of a single intervention. They are stories of recurring oversight. This is where the lens begins to shift. What if ancient cultures were not describing visitors as singular beings, but as a category? Not individuals, but a system. Not a one-time arrival, but a recurring process. This idea unsettles modern thinking because it challenges the assumption that interaction must be exceptional to be meaningful. Instead, it suggests regularity, a schedule, perhaps even expectation. The discomfort arises because repetition implies predictability, and predictability implies responsibility. If something returns again and again, then its presence is not accidental, and neither is its absence. This raises a deeper question. What if the true mystery is not who the visitors were, but why their patterns align so closely with moments of human transformation? Each arrival coincides with shifts in social structure. Each departure follows periods of instability. Each return introduces new frameworks: agriculture, law, astronomy, architecture, ritual. This is not speculation. It is observable in the timelines of multiple civilizations. The challenge is interpretation. Some scholars propose that these visitors are symbolic representations of human elites, priesthoods, or knowledge classes. Others argue they encode natural forces, climate cycles, astronomical events, or environmental stressors, and still others suggest they reflect encounters that early humans lacked language to describe directly. All of these interpretations remain debated, but none fully address the cyclical nature of the accounts, because cycles require memory. Someone, or something, must remember when to return. This is where modern systems like 3i Atlas inadvertently complicate the picture. By focusing on singular anomalies, they reinforce linear thinking. But ancient narratives operate differently. They describe time as layered, not straight. Past and future fold into one another. Events do not end. They pause. In this worldview, the visitors are not invaders or saviours. They are participants in a larger rhythm, and humanity is not merely acted upon, it adapts, it reorganises, it responds. This reframing removes the dramatic extremes. No conquest, no enslavement, no divine rescue. Instead, we see something quieter and more unsettling. Intervention without permanence, guidance without guardianship, presence without promise. The core question then becomes unavoidable. If these cycles are real, even metaphorically, what triggers them? Is it human behaviour, environmental thresholds, astronomical alignment, or something else entirely? Ancient records rarely give direct answers, but they give clues. They emphasise balance. They warn against forgetting. They describe periods where humans drift away from certain practices, only to experience disruption. Then, after loss, the pattern resets. The visitors return, not to save, but to recalibrate. This interpretation does not require belief in extraterrestrial beings. It requires acknowledgement that ancient cultures track change differently than we do. They embedded warning systems in story. They preserved timelines in myth. They encoded observation in ritual. And they understood something modern societies struggle with, that progress is not permanent, it is conditional. This brings us back to the Atlas anomaly. The issue is not whether 3i Atlas detects something real. The issue is whether we are interpreting it with a mindset capable of understanding cycles. Modern analysis seeks endpoints. Ancient narratives expect recurrence. This mismatch may be why so many discussions feel unsatisfying. We look for conclusions where none exist. Ancient cultures did not ask, "Will they come?" They asked, "When will the pattern change again?" This difference is subtle, but it reshapes everything. If the visitors were part of a recurring cycle, then humanity's role shifts. We are no longer passive recipients. We become variables within the pattern. Our choices matter, our structures matter, our memory matters. And forgetting may be the most dangerous act of all. As we move deeper into this story, we will begin mapping these cycles across cultures, not to prove contact, not to claim certainty, but to ask a more grounded question. What were ancient people actually observing that made repetition the most important part of the story? That question remains open, and it leads us directly into the next segment, where we begin tracing these cycles across time, geography, and culture to see whether the pattern truly holds. To understand whether these ancient stories truly describe a cycle, we have to resist the temptation to jump ahead. Cycles are not proven by endings. They are proven by beginnings that look strangely familiar. So we start not with the Anunnaki alone, and not with one civilization, but with a method, a comparative one. When scholars study ancient cultures independently, similarities can be dismissed as coincidence. But when those cultures are placed side by side, without assuming influence, patterns begin to emerge that coincidence struggles to explain. The first pattern is arrival. Across ancient texts, the arrival of the visitors is rarely dramatic in the way modern fiction imagines it. There are no battles in the sky, no invasions, no immediate domination. Instead, there is recognition. In Sumerian accounts, the Anunnaki are acknowledged as already known when they appear in written form. Their arrival is not described as a shock, but as a re-establishment of presence. In early Egyptian traditions, the gods arrive during the first time, a period not of chaos, but of ordering. They do not conquer humanity, they instruct it. In Mesoamerican myths, the creators appear after a failed age, not at the beginning of existence. They assess what remains, then begin again. This is important. The visitors do not arrive at creation. They arrive after interruption. This alone challenges the idea of a single, original intervention. If these beings were responsible for humanity's origin, why do so many cultures describe them appearing after humans already exist? The second pattern is instruction. The visitors do not merely observe, they teach. But what they teach is remarkably consistent across cultures. Not technology in the modern sense, not weapons, not dominance. They teach measurement, timekeeping, agriculture, law, architecture aligned with the sky, ritual practice. In Sumer, the me, the divine ordinances, are not tools, but principles that govern society. In Egypt, Ma'at is not a god, but a concept, balance, order, measure. In the Andes, Viracocha teaches agriculture and social structure, then departs. In China, the culture heroes introduce calendars, flood control, and moral governance. These teachings are foundational, not advanced. They stabilize society rather than accelerate it. This suggests that the goal was not progress, but continuity. The third pattern is withdrawal. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these myths is how abruptly the visitors leave. There is rarely a farewell. Sometimes there is a warning, sometimes a promise of return, often nothing at all. The gods ascend, they retreat to the heavens, they withdraw beneath the earth, they become invisible, and humanity is left alone. This withdrawal often coincides with environmental stress or social collapse, floods, droughts, dark ages, fragmentation. The implication is subtle but consistent. The visitors do not prevent collapse, they allow it. This contradicts the idea of benevolent overseers or cruel masters. Instead, it suggests conditional involvement. Presence is temporary. Absence is expected. Now we examine the fourth pattern, return. This is where the cycle becomes undeniable. After periods of loss, sometimes centuries long, stories describe the visitors reappearing, not always in the same form, not always under the same name, but with recognizable traits. They arrive again to restore order, to reset calendars, to redefine law, to re-anchor humanity in a changed world. In Mesoamerica, this is explicit. World ages end and begin. Each age has its own creators. In India, the avatars of Vishnu appear repeatedly, not once. In Mesopotamia, divine assemblies reconvene after catastrophe. In Norse myth, even Ragnarok is not an ending. It is followed by renewal and return. These are not linear stories. They are cyclical frameworks. At this point, skeptics often argue that cycles are simply a human storytelling preference, that humans naturally structure narratives around repetition. This may be partly true, but the issue is not that cycles exist. It is that the same kind of cycle exists across cultures with no direct contact. The sequence is consistent. Presence, instruction, withdrawal, disruption, return. The order does not change, and this is where the idea of a single, one-time visitor becomes insufficient. A single entity does not explain repeated engagement across millennia unless the visitors were not individuals, but a function, a role that emerges under certain conditions. This idea may feel abstract, but it aligns with how ancient cultures thought. They did not personify forces randomly. They personified processes. Storms became gods. Seasons became deities. Cycles became beings. This does not mean the visitors were imaginary. It means their reality may not map cleanly onto modern categories. They could represent advanced humans from previous cycles. They could encode astronomical events. They could symbolize ecological thresholds. What matters is not who they were, but how they were remembered. They were remembered as recurring, and recurrence implies observation. Something was noticed, remembered, and passed down. Now we return briefly to 3i Atlas. Modern systems track recurrence too: seismic cycles, solar cycles, magnetic reversals, climate oscillations. But we separate these into disciplines. Ancient cultures did not. They integrated observation into myth. This integration allowed them to see patterns across domains. Where modern science fragments knowledge for precision, ancient systems unified it for meaning. Neither approach is superior, but they serve different purposes. The danger lies in assuming one replaces the other. If ancient narratives encode pattern recognition across long timescales, dismissing them entirely may cost us insight, not prediction, orientation toward change. This brings us to the core tension. Modern interpretations often ask, did these visitors really exist? Ancient texts ask a different question. What happens when they leave? That question assumes departure. It assumes absence. It assumes that humanity must function without guidance. This assumption is everywhere in ancient literature, and it suggests something deeply human. That guidance was never meant to be permanent. That autonomy emerges through loss. This reframes the entire discussion. The visitors are not masters. They are catalysts. They appear when conditions allow. They withdraw when conditions demand human adaptation. And they return when patterns align again. This is not a comforting story. It removes certainty. It removes rescue. It places responsibility back on humanity. Perhaps this is why the cycle is so often misunderstood. A single arrival is easier to process than an ongoing pattern. A one-time event absolves us of responsibility. A cycle demands participation, As we move into the next segment, we will examine how ancient astronomers, priests, and observers tracked these cycles, not through technology, but through time itself. Because if the visitors returned on schedule, someone had to be watching the clock. And that clock may not have been mechanical at all. If cycles existed, then memory alone would not be enough. Stories fade, oral traditions shift, symbols change meaning over time. For a cycle to be recognised across generations, something more durable was required. Time had to be measured, not casually, not seasonally, but across spans longer than a human life. This is where ancient astronomy enters the discussion, not as mysticism, but as one of humanity's earliest scientific disciplines. Long before telescopes, ancient observers watched the sky with patience that modern life rarely allows. They tracked rising stars, planetary motion, eclipses, solstices, equinoxes, not once, but over lifetimes, and then over lifetimes again. In Mesopotamia, clay tablets record astronomical observations with striking precision. These were not myths written as poetry. They were logs, dates, positions, intervals. Some tablets list planetary cycles stretching back centuries. Others document eclipse patterns that require generations of consistent observation to predict. This is not controversial. Assyriologists and historians of science agree that Babylonian astronomers were among the most sophisticated observers of the ancient world. But what is often overlooked is why this precision mattered. Agriculture explains part of it. Religion explains part of it. But neither fully explains the obsession with long cycles. Cycles too long to benefit the individual observer. Why track something you will never see complete unless the cycle itself carried meaning beyond utility? In Sumerian tradition, time was not linear. It unfolded in great ages. Kingship descended from the heavens. Kingship was withdrawn. Kingship returned. This pattern repeats in king lists that stretch improbably far into the past, sometimes spanning tens of thousands of years before a great flood interrupts the record. Modern scholars interpret these early reigns symbolically, not literally, and rightly so. But symbolism does not negate purpose. The pattern matters more than the numbers. Long stability, abrupt collapse, renewal. The same structure appears in Egyptian cosmology. The Zep Tepi, the first time, was not a single moment. It was a condition, a period when gods and humans coexisted in balance. When that balance broke, the gods withdrew, and history as we know it began. This framing suggests that ancient people did not see the gods as ever present. They were episodic. Their presence marked certain eras, not all time. In Mesoamerica, the Maya tracked time with staggering complexity. Their long count calendar spans millions of years, not because they expected to live that long, but because cycles mattered, world ages mattered, the completion of cycles mattered. When one Baktun ended, rituals were performed, not in panic, but in recognition. Time itself was an event, and time was watched. What unites these cultures is not belief in identical beings, it is belief in recurrence. Now consider what recurrence requires. Prediction. Prediction requires pattern recognition. Pattern recognition requires data, and data requires continuity. Someone somewhere had to be keeping records long enough to notice repetition. This does not require advanced technology. It requires patience, institutional memory, and reverence for continuity. Ancient temples were not just places of worship. They were archives. They preserved knowledge across generations. They trained scribes. They standardized measurements. They ensured that what one generation observed could be compared with what came before. This is how cycles survive, not through myth alone, but through record. Now we return briefly to the idea of the visitors. Ancient texts rarely describe them as unpredictable. They are expected, sometimes feared, sometimes welcomed, but rarely unexpected. This suggests timing. If a culture expects return, it implies a schedule, even if imperfectly understood. In Hindu tradition, the Yugas cycle through immense spans of time. Each age degrades in moral and environmental quality. When degradation peaks, renewal occurs, not randomly, but according to cosmic law. In Norse myth, Ragnarok is foretold in detail. The gods know it is coming. They do not stop it. They prepare for what follows. Again, not chaos, sequence. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if ancient people did not see catastrophe as failure? What if collapse was part of maintenance? This idea challenges modern assumptions. We treat disaster as aberration. Ancient cultures often treated it as transition. This does not mean they welcomed it. It means they contextualized it. Now consider how this applies to the visitors. If these beings or forces were tied to cycles, their appearance would coincide with transitions, not prosperity, but thresholds, moments when systems could no longer sustain themselves. This aligns with when gods appear in myths, not during stability, but after breakdown, after flood, after fire, after darkness. They arrive when something must be reset, teach, re-anchor, then withdraw. If this pattern holds, then the visitors were not managing humanity continuously. They intervened selectively. And this brings us to a crucial distinction. Intervention is not control. Intervention implies distance, observation, timing, which raises the question, what were they observing? Ancient texts do not say explicitly, but they hint, balance, order, alignment. When balance breaks, consequences follow. Floods are not punishments in many myths, they are corrections. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the flood is caused by divine dissatisfaction, not with humanity's morality, but with its noise, its excess, its disruption of equilibrium. This is telling. The problem is not sin, it is imbalance. An imbalance triggers reset. This is remarkably similar to how natural systems behave. Ecologies collapse when thresholds are crossed. Climate shifts when feedback loops dominate. Geological systems release pressure when stress accumulates. Nature does not punish, it responds. Ancient people may have understood this intuitively. They encoded it symbolically. They personified forces to make them intelligible. The visitors may represent these forces or those who understood them deeply. This interpretation does not require aliens. It does not deny them either. It simply reframes the question. Instead of asking who were they, we ask what role did they play? And that role appears consistent. They mark transitions, they restore order, they depart. Now we circle back to modern monitoring systems like 3i Atlas. These systems track stress, seismic stress, atmospheric stress, environmental stress. They do not predict catastrophe in mythic terms, but they observe thresholds. When stress accumulates beyond tolerance, release occurs. Ancient myths describe the same phenomenon in different language, with different tools, but with similar insight. This is where the parallel becomes unsettling, not because ancient prophecies are coming true, but because ancient people recognized patterns we still grapple with. Patterns of build-up, patterns of release, patterns of return. If the visitors are remembered at these moments, perhaps they were never separate from the system. Perhaps they were expressions of it, or stewards of it, or observers tasked with responding when thresholds were crossed. This would explain why they do not save humanity from collapse. Collapse may be necessary. Reset may be unavoidable. What they offer instead is continuity, memory, a way forward after disruption. This is not comforting, but it is coherent, and coherence is what we are seeking. In the next segment, we will examine how these cycles appear not only in myth and astronomy, but in the physical record itself, in layers of earth, in sudden population shifts, in unexplained technological discontinuities, because stories are one thing, but the ground remembers too. The earth keeps records in a language older than writing. Long before tablets were pressed or stars were named, layers of sediment were quietly forming, each one a page in a planetary archive. These layers do not speak in stories, they speak in interruptions, in sudden deposits of silt, in ash horizons, in abrupt climate, shifts captured in ice cores and fossil pollen. And when these layers are read carefully, a pattern begins to emerge, one that mirrors the ancient idea of cycles far more closely than we might expect. For much of the 20th century, geology assumed gradualism, change was slow, processes were steady, the past unfolded gently into the present. This assumption made sense. Most geological change is slow, but it is not always. Beginning in the late 20th century, researchers began documenting events that did not fit gradual models: abrupt climate shifts, rapid sea level rise, sudden ecological collapse, events occurring not over millennia, but within decades, sometimes years. One of the most studied examples is the transition out of the last ice age. For a long time, this period was imagined as a smooth warming. Instead, ice core data revealed chaos. The climate oscillated wildly. Temperatures rose sharply, then plunged back into glacial conditions. This period, known as the Younger Dryas, began suddenly, within a generation, then ended just as abruptly. What caused it remains debated. Some scholars point to changes in ocean circulation, others to freshwater influx from melting ice sheets. Still others explore extraterrestrial impact hypotheses, though these remain controversial. What matters here is not the cause, it is the pattern, sudden shift, instability, reset. Human societies did not experience this abstractly. They lived through it. Archaeological evidence shows widespread cultural disruption at this boundary. Settlements disappear. Tool traditions change rapidly. Population densities fluctuate. In some regions, humans retreat. In others, new forms of organisation appear. Agriculture emerges not long after. This timing has puzzled researchers for decades. Why did large-scale civilization arise after instability, not during abundance? Why do cities appear following disruption? One answer may be necessity, but another possibility is preparedness. Cultures that survive instability are forced to reorganize. They develop new strategies, new hierarchies, new technologies. This aligns closely with ancient narratives. Civilization does not begin in golden ages. It begins after loss. Now consider another pattern. Across multiple regions, archaeologists observe what are called dark horizons, layers where evidence of human activity diminishes sharply. Not complete extinction, but thinning. Then, above these layers, new cultural expressions appear. Different art, different architecture, different cosmologies. It is tempting to view this as replacement, but often genetic evidence suggests continuity. The same people remain, but something about their world has changed. Their memory has been interrupted. This is where myth becomes relevant again. Ancient cultures speak of ages before the present one, not metaphorically, structurally. Ages that ended, ages whose knowledge was partially lost, ages remembered imperfectly. In Plato's account of Atlantis, the story is already ancient when he hears it, passed down through Egyptian priests. Each retelling acknowledges loss. The Egyptians say that Greeks forget repeatedly, wiped clean by floods and fires. Only fragments remain. This is not mythology in the modern sense. It is an explanation for why history feels discontinuous, why knowledge reappears, why civilization seems to restart. The idea of cyclical loss and recovery appears everywhere. in Mesopotamia, in India, in Mesoamerica, in the Andes, different symbols, same structure. And this brings us back to the visitors. If such beings were remembered at moments of renewal, we must ask why. Ancient texts rarely credit them with creation ex nihilo. They do not invent humanity. They shape it, teach it, reorganize it after disruption. This is consistent. In Sumerian texts, the Apkallu, semi-divine sages appear after chaos. They restore order. They teach arts and sciences. Then they withdraw. Some are said to return to the deep. Others are punished when boundaries are crossed. Again, this is not presented as a continuous presence. It is episodic. In Egyptian tradition, the gods rule directly only in the distant past. Later they retreat. Kings rule in their stead. In Mesoamerica, the gods create humanity multiple times. Each version fails. Each age ends. The current age is fragile. These stories are not optimistic. They are instructive. They emphasize that continuity is not guaranteed. Now let us consider a more grounded explanation. What if the visitors were not external beings, but survivors, carriers of knowledge from a previous age? This idea has been proposed cautiously by some researchers, not as fact, as hypothesis. If advanced knowledge existed prior to a collapse, it could survive in small groups. Those groups would appear suddenly to later societies. They would possess skills others lacked. They would be remembered as gods. This hypothesis does not require aliens. It requires catastrophe. It requires bottlenecks. It requires uneven survival. And it aligns disturbingly well with the archaeological record. However, this explanation alone does not account for the precision of ancient astronomical knowledge, nor does it explain the recurrence of similar motifs across disconnected regions, unless contact existed earlier than we assume, or unless these patterns arise independently from shared observation of the same sky and earth. Which brings us to a critical point. Cycles do not require teachers, they require observers. If multiple cultures experience the same disruptions, floods, droughts, cold snaps, they will encode similar warnings. They will mythologize similar lessons. They will personify similar forces. The visitors may be less important than what they represent. They represent memory. They represent the idea that something returns. That stability is temporary. That vigilance matters. In this reading, the visitors are not controllers. They are reminders, symbols of recurrence, markers of transition. This reframes the entire discussion. Instead of asking whether ancient beings visited Earth, we ask why ancient people needed the idea of visitation. What psychological function did it serve? One answer is accountability. If disruption is random, it is terrifying. If disruption is patterned, it is survivable. Ancient myths often emphasize warning, not prevention. Warning allows preparation. Preparation preserves continuity. Now consider modern society. We have unprecedented data. We monitor the Earth constantly. Yet we often lack shared meaning. We track stress, but struggle to interpret it collectively. Ancient societies may have lacked precision, but they possessed narrative coherence. Their stories aligned people psychologically. This may be the true legacy of the visitors. Not technology, not intervention, but narrative frameworks that helped societies survive disruption without losing identity. In the next segment, we will examine how these frameworks manifest in ritual, architecture, and encoded symbolism. How memory was built into stone, not just story, because some warnings were never meant to be read. They were meant to be inhabited. If memory was meant to survive collapse, then it could not rely solely on fragile media. Stories can be forgotten. Tablets can break. Languages can disappear, but stone endures. Across the ancient world, certain structures appear that resist easy explanation, not because they are mysterious in isolation, but because of how consistently they encode the same priorities. Orientation, alignment, repetition. These structures were not merely shelters or monuments, they were instruments. Many ancient sites are aligned with celestial events, so precise that their builders must have tracked the sky for generations. This is not speculation, it is measurable. Stone circles align with solstices. Temples face heliacal risings of specific stars. Pyramids mirror cardinal directions with extraordinary accuracy. What is less discussed is why this mattered so deeply. Agriculture explains some alignments. Religion explains others. But neither fully explains the emphasis on long cycles, events that occur rarely, sometimes once in a human lifetime, sometimes once every few generations. Why build stone to mark something you may never personally witness, unless the marker is not for you, unless it is for those who come after? This suggests a different purpose. Architecture as memory, not decorative memory, functional memory. Göbekli Tepe is often cited in this context, and cautiously so. It predates agriculture. It required coordinated labour. It shows no evidence of permanent habitation. Its pillars are carved with animals, symbols, and abstract forms whose meaning remains debated. What is most striking is not the imagery. It is the decision to build at all. Hunter-gatherers are not supposed to invest in immovable monuments, yet they did. And then they buried them deliberately, layer after layer. This was not abandonment, it was closure. Some archaeologists propose that Göbekli Tepe functioned as a ritual centre. Others said when ancient cultures spoke of the end, they rarely meant extinction. This is one of the most persistent misunderstandings carried into modern readings of ancient prophecy. We hear end of the world and imagine obliteration. Ancient societies heard something else. They heard closure. They heard transition. They heard the completion of a phase that could no longer continue. This distinction matters because it shapes how fear is processed. In a linear worldview, the end is final. In a cyclical worldview, the end is necessary. Ancient prophecies were not obsessed with survival. They were concerned with continuity. The world, as they understood it, was not a static object. It was a process. And processes have stages. This perspective appears again and again across cultures. In Norse tradition, Ragnarok is not merely destruction. The gods fall, the world burns, the sea rises, and then a new world emerges, green, renewed, populated by survivors. The cycle completes. Ragnarok is not failure, it is renewal through loss. In Hindu cosmology, the end of a yuga is not catastrophe, it is recalibration. The universe dissolves into potential, then reforms. The gods do not panic, they wait. This patience reflects expectation. Endings were expected. They were integrated into worldview. In Mesoamerican belief systems, the gods create humanity multiple times. Each version collapses. Each teaches something. The current age is not privileged. It is provisional. This is profoundly different from modern assumptions. We assume this world must be preserved indefinitely. Ancient cultures assumed no world lasts indefinitely. This does not mean they were indifferent to suffering. It means they contextualized it. Suffering was not meaningless. It was transitional. This framing had enormous psychological impact. It allowed societies to endure collapse without existential despair. Now consider how prophecy functioned within this worldview. Prophecy was not fortune-telling. It was pattern recognition. Prophets did not predict random events. They identified signals that indicated thresholds were approaching. Environmental disruption, moral imbalance, social rigidity. These were not supernatural insights. They were systemic observations. Prophecy translated observation into narrative. This made it communicable, accessible, actionable. If floods follow deforestation, prophecy warns of flood. If inequality precedes collapse, prophecy warns of judgment. If cycles repeat, prophecy warns of return. Ancient prophets were not predicting novelty. They were announcing inevitability. This is why prophecy often feels vague, because it addresses processes, not specifics. Now consider how the visitors fit into prophetic traditions. They are often described as returning at the end of an age, not to save everyone, but to witness, to judge, to re-establish order. They are associated with thresholds, not outcomes. This is crucial. If they were purely benevolent guardians, they would intervene continuously. They do not. They appear when conditions are no longer sustainable. This suggests restraint, or limitation, or alignment with larger systems. Again, this does not require extraterrestrial explanation. It requires consistency. The consistency is what ancient people noticed. Now let us ground this further. Modern science recognizes tipping points. Climate systems shift abruptly after thresholds are crossed. Ecosystems collapse suddenly after long stability. Ice sheets disintegrate rapidly after gradual warming. These are not apocalyptic fantasies. They are documented phenomena. Ancient cultures experienced these transitions without scientific language. They experienced them directly. They encoded them symbolically. This encoding preserved awareness across generations, which returns us to a core idea. Ancient prophecy was not meant to terrify. It was meant to prepare. Preparation does not eliminate loss. It reduces shock. It preserves coherence. This is why ancient end-time narratives include instruction, build boats, store grain, preserve knowledge, maintain memory. The stories emphasize survival through awareness, not avoidance. The ark is not salvation from flood. It is continuity through flood. The mountain retreat is not escape. It is waiting. The cave is not hiding. It is preservation. These motifs appear globally. They are not about conquest. They are about endurance. Which raises a question. If ancient societies repeatedly encoded the same message, that collapse comes and preparation matters, why do modern interpretations focus on spectacle? Perhaps because we have lost confidence in our ability to adapt. Ancient people did not believe they could prevent cycles. They believed they could survive them. Modern societies often believe the opposite. This difference may explain why ancient warnings feel unsettling today. They challenge our assumption of permanence. Now consider the phrase, forgotten prophecies. What was forgotten? Not dates, not predictions, but posture. The posture of acceptance without surrender, of vigilance without panic, of humility without despair. This posture is difficult to sustain in a culture built on growth. Ancient cultures accepted contraction. They planned for it. This does not mean they desired it. It means they recognized its inevitability. And here, again, the visitors function symbolically. They appear at moments of reckoning. They do not offer rescue. They offer recalibration. They remind humanity of limits. This is not comforting, but it is stabilizing. In ancient narratives, the most dangerous state is denial, when warnings are ignored, when signs are dismissed, when imbalance is normalized. Collapse then appears sudden, but it was not. It was delayed. Now bring this back to the present. Modern systems detect stress earlier than any society before. We have data ancient people could not imagine, but data alone does not create preparedness. Preparedness requires shared meaning, narrative, context. Ancient prophecy provided this context, not as certainty, but as expectation. This expectation softened the psychological impact of collapse. The end of the world, in ancient terms, was not annihilation, it was graduation. graduation into uncertainty, but also into renewal. This reframing matters because it shifts focus from fear to continuity, from survival of structures to survival of meaning. In the next segment, we will explore how memory itself was protected across endings, how knowledge was hidden, simplified or ritualized so it could survive collapse and re-emerge afterward. Because if endings are inevitable, then memory becomes the most valuable inheritance, and ancient societies treated it accordingly. If endings were expected, then memory itself became a form of technology, not technology in the modern sense of machines or tools, but technology as method, as strategy, as design. Ancient societies understood something subtle but critical. Complex knowledge does not survive chaos. Simple knowledge does. This is why the most important information was rarely preserved in its most advanced form. It was compressed, symbolized, encoded into stories, rituals, and practices that could be remembered even when writing was lost. This is not speculation. Anthropologists and historians observe this pattern repeatedly. After societal collapse, technical expertise vanishes quickly. Metallurgy declines. Architecture simplifies. Administrative systems disappear. But myths remain. Songs remain. Rituals remain. They persist because they do not require infrastructure. They require participation. This is why ancient cultures embedded practical knowledge inside narrative. Flood stories are not geology textbooks, but they teach when water becomes dangerous. Agricultural myths are not manuals, but they encode seasonal timing. Cosmologies are not star charts, but they preserve orientation and cycle awareness. This approach ensured that even if cities fell, patterns survived, and patterns were enough to rebuild. Now consider how this applies to the idea of the visitors. If advanced knowledge existed, whether from external beings, prior civilizations, or cumulative observation, preserving it intact would be nearly impossible through collapse. Instead, it would be distilled. The core ideas would be wrapped in symbolism, removed from direct explanation. This is exactly what we see. Ancient texts rarely explain how gods achieved feats. They describe that they did. The method is obscured. This is frustrating to modern readers. But it may be intentional. Methods change, principles endure. The principle repeated across myths is balance, alignment, timing, respect for thresholds. This is knowledge that survives technological regression. Now let us look at specific preservation strategies. One is fragmentation. Instead of placing all knowledge in one place, it is distributed. Different cultures preserve different aspects. No single society holds the whole picture. This makes total loss less likely. It also explains why myths feel incomplete. They are incomplete by design. Another strategy is repetition. Important ideas are repeated constantly. In rituals, in festivals, in daily practices. Repetition trains memory. It ensures survival even when meaning degrades. A ritual can be performed long after its original purpose is forgotten, but the structure remains, and structure can be reinterpreted. A third strategy is concealment. Some knowledge is hidden deliberately. Initiation rituals restrict access. Symbolic language obscures meaning. This is not elitism alone, it is protection. In times of instability, knowledge can be dangerous. Power attracts violence. Ancient cultures often restricted advanced knowledge to preserve social balance. This does not mean they hoarded it indefinitely. It means they controlled its release. Now consider how these strategies affect our interpretation of ancient texts. Modern readers often expect clarity. Ancient texts offer resonance. They expect the reader to already know something, to approach gradually, to accept ambiguity. This mismatch creates frustration, but it also creates endurance. Ambiguous texts survive because they adapt to new contexts. clear instructions become obsolete. Symbols remain relevant. This is why ancient warnings feel timeless. They are not bound to one event. They describe conditions. This brings us back to cyclical patterns. If cycles repeat, then preserving recognition matters more than preserving specifics. Knowing that a flood comes is more important than knowing when. Knowing that imbalance leads to collapse is more important than knowing the exact mechanism. This perspective reframes the role of prophecy again. Prophecy is not prediction. It is pattern education. It trains perception. It teaches what to watch for. Ancient societies did not ask, what will happen? They asked, what always happens? This is a crucial difference, and it may explain why modern audiences struggle with ancient texts. We seek novelty. Ancient people sought continuity. Now consider memory across generations. In oral cultures, elders were repositories. Their authority came not from power, but from memory. They remembered previous disruptions. They recognized early signs. They advised caution. When elders disappear through war, disease, or displacement, memory collapses. Societies become vulnerable. This vulnerability is often mistaken for ignorance, but it is amnesia. Ancient myths frequently include figures who warn and are ignored. This is not moralism, it is documentation. Societies forget, then relearn, painfully. The visitors often appear in these moments, not as saviours, but as validators. They confirm what was forgotten. They remind humanity of lessons learned before. This interpretation aligns with how ancient cultures treated ancestors. Ancestors were not passive. They guided, warned, intervened through dreams and signs. The line between ancestor, god, and visitor is often blurred. This suggests a continuum of memory, not separate categories. Now let us consider an alternative possibility. What if the visitors represent the persistence of knowledge itself? Not beings, but carriers. Carriers could be people, or institutions, or traditions. Over time, these carriers acquire mythic status. Their origin is forgotten. Their function remains. This does not reduce the mystery, it reframes it. The question shifts from who were they to what survived through them, and the answer appears consistent. Knowledge of cycles, knowledge of thresholds, knowledge of impermanence. This knowledge is uncomfortable. It challenges power. It undermines permanence, which may explain why it is repeatedly buried, forgotten, rediscovered. Civilizations oscillate between remembering and forgetting. Each rediscovery feels like revelation. Each forgetting feels like decline. This oscillation mirrors the cycles themselves. Memory is not linear, it is periodic. This may be the deepest pattern of all. The visitors do not return physically. They return conceptually. When conditions repeat, their lessons become relevant again. Now bring this back to modern systems. We preserve data digitally, at unprecedented scale. Yet digital memory is fragile. It requires energy, infrastructure, stability. A major disruption could erase vast archives instantly. Ancient societies assumed loss. They planned accordingly. They compressed memory into resilient forms, stories, symbols, rituals, practices. These can survive without power, without servers, without institutions. This is not romanticism, it is resilience engineering. The most enduring technology may not be machines, it may be meaning. In the next segment, we will examine how modern interpretations, scientific, cultural and speculative, attempt to reconcile ancient cycles with contemporary observation, not to draw conclusions, but to understand why this question refuses to disappear, because some ideas persist not because they are proven, but because they remain useful. In every age, humanity believes it is finally seeing clearly. New instruments emerge. New measurements refine understanding. Old explanations feel inadequate, and yet certain questions persist. They do not disappear with better data, they adapt. In the modern era, cycles have returned, not through myth, but through models. Climate science speaks in feedback loops, ecology in thresholds, geology in stress accumulation and release. None of these concepts require ancient prophecy, and yet the structure is familiar. Long stability, gradual pressure, sudden transition. This is not coincidence, it is how complex systems behave. Modern science describes this mathematically. Ancient cultures described it symbolically. The language differs, the insight overlaps. This overlap has led to renewed interest in ancient records, not as predictions, but as reflections of long-term observation. Scholars studying paleoclimatology have noted that many ancient flood narratives align loosely with periods of rapid sea level rise following glacial melt, not precisely, not universally, but often enough to invite examination. This does not mean ancient texts recorded specific events verbatim. It suggests they preserved memory of instability, memory of a world that changed faster than expected. Similarly, ice core records show abrupt temperature shifts that would have been devastating to early societies. These shifts were not subtle, they transformed landscapes within generations. For people living through them, the experience would feel apocalyptic, not because the planet ended, but because their world did. Modern science now recognizes that such rapid transitions are possible. They are not common, but they are real. This recognition has changed how we understand the past and the future, and has quietly reawakened ancient concerns. The question is no longer if large-scale change can occur. It is how societies respond when it does. Ancient responses were narrative. They told stories. They personified forces. They ritualized transition. Modern responses are analytical. We model scenarios. We quantify risk. We simulate outcomes. Both approaches aim at the same goal: preparation. Yet preparation is not purely technical, it is psychological. This is where ancient frameworks remain relevant. They address fear, meaning, identity. They provide continuity when external structures fail. This may explain why modern audiences continue to return to ancient myths when facing uncertainty, not because they reject science, but because science does not tell us how to feel about change. Ancient stories do. This intersection between data and meaning is where the idea of the visitors resurfaces most strongly today. Modern interpretations often frame them as external intelligences, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, advanced beyond human comprehension. These ideas are speculative. They are not supported by direct evidence, but they persist because they address a psychological gap. They offer agency where systems feel impersonal. They imply intention where randomness is unsettling. Ancient cultures did the same thing. They personified forces to make them comprehensible. This does not mean they were naive. It means they understood narrative as a survival tool. Now consider how the cyclical visitors concept functions in modern discourse. It suggests that humanity is not alone in navigating transitions. That guidance has appeared before, that patterns have been noticed and responded to. This framing is comforting, but also challenging, because it implies responsibility. If cycles repeat, then ignorance is no longer an excuse. This may explain resistance to cyclical thinking. Accepting cycles undermines the myth of perpetual progress. It forces humility. It acknowledges limits. Modern culture struggles with this. We prefer narratives of control. Ancient narratives accepted constraint. This difference creates tension. Some modern thinkers attempt to bridge this gap by reframing ancient myths as early scientific observation. Others treat them as allegory. Still others see them as encoded warnings. None of these approaches have achieved consensus, but their coexistence is telling. It suggests that the ancient material remains unresolved, not because it is inaccurate, but because it addresses questions that cannot be closed. Questions about fragility, about recurrence, about humanity's place within larger systems. Now let us consider the role of technology. Modern monitoring systems detect stress earlier than ever. Seismic arrays track movement beneath the crust. Satellites observe atmospheric shifts. Data streams quantify change continuously, yet data does not equal understanding. Understanding requires context. Ancient societies embedded context into story. Modern societies embed it into models. Both can fail. Models fail when assumptions break. Stories fail when memory fades. The most resilient approach may be hybrid. Data informed by meaning, meaning informed by data. This is not mysticism. It is systems thinking. Ancient people practiced it intuitively. Modern science practices it explicitly. The idea of cyclical visitors sits at the boundary between these modes. It invites us to consider that ancient observations were not primitive. They were holistic. They integrated environment, society, psychology and cosmology. This integration is difficult to maintain today. Specialization fragments understanding. Experts know deeply, but narrowly. Ancient myths preserved breadth. They connected everything. This breadth is why they endure. Now we must ask an uncomfortable question. If ancient societies encoded warnings about cycles, and modern science confirms the existence of thresholds, why does preparation still feel elusive? One answer is scale. Ancient societies were smaller. Adaptation occurred locally. Modern civilization is global. Disruption propagates widely. Local adaptation may not suffice. Another answer is expectation. Ancient people expected loss. Modern people expect preservation. Expectation shapes response. If loss is unthinkable, response is delayed. Ancient narratives normalized loss. They framed it as passage. This does not reduce suffering, but it reduces shock. This distinction may determine survival. The visitors, in this sense, represent acceptance. They appear at moments when denial fails. They mark transitions that can no longer be postponed. This is not about fear. It is about readiness. Modern interpretations often focus on whether the visitors are returning. Ancient narratives focus on whether humanity is listening. This is the deeper question. Listening does not mean believing literally. It means attending to patterns, recognizing limits, preparing psychologically for change. This is where ancient wisdom intersects with modern necessity, not as prophecy, but as posture. In the next segment, we will narrow the focus. We will examine how individuals, not civilizations, responded to cycles, how daily life adapted, how families preserved meaning when structures collapsed. Because in the end, survival is not abstract, it is personal. And ancient stories understood this profoundly. When civilizations fracture, it is not cities that decide what survives. It is people. This is a detail ancient stories understood instinctively. They rarely linger on administrative collapse. They focus instead on households, journeys, and choices made quietly at the edge of uncertainty, because continuity does not move as a mass. It moves person by person, family by family, memory by memory. In ancient narratives, collapse often begins off-stage. The city is already unstable when the story starts. The listener is not told how the walls fell. They are told how someone left. A farmer abandons fields that no longer yield. A family follows the river upstream. A traveller notices the road is no longer safe. These stories are not epic. They are intimate. They emphasize observation, decision, timing. which raises an important question. How did ancient individuals know when to adapt? They did not have instruments. They did not have centralized alerts. They relied on pattern recognition. And this skill was cultivated deliberately. Children were taught to notice change. Not abstract change, practical change, the behaviour of animals, the timing of seasons, the sound of water, the quality of soil. These observations were embedded into stories so they would be remembered under stress. A myth about a river god becoming angry is not about theology, it is about flood risk. A story of a sky serpent blocking the sun is not about monsters, it is about eclipse and fear. A warning about gods withdrawing is not abandonment, it is environmental change. These stories trained attention. They taught listeners to detect deviation from normal patterns, which is the first step of adaptation. Now consider how this training differs from modern experience. Today, we outsource observation. Sensors detect change. Institutions interpret it. Individuals wait for guidance. This is efficient, until it fails. When systems hesitate, individuals lack internal frameworks for response. Ancient individuals were expected to decide, not perfectly, but decisively. This expectation reduced paralysis. Ancient warnings rarely told people what will happen. They told people what always happens when conditions repeat. This empowered personal judgment. Now return to the idea of cyclical visitors. If such figures were remembered during transitions, they likely interacted with individuals, not masses. Ancient stories often depict encounters with a single shepherd, a single king, a single family. The message spreads outward. This structure matters. Change begins locally. Preparation begins privately. Civilization responds collectively only after individuals move. This is consistent with archaeological evidence. Large population shifts occur after long periods of localized adaptation, not before. This suggests that ancient societies did not wait for collapse to reorganize. They adjusted gradually, quietly, until the old structures became irrelevant. This gradualism is not visible in historical summaries. It is visible in the lives. Now consider how ancient individuals preserved meaning during upheaval. They carried small things, songs, symbols, tools, seeds, portable knowledge. The most valuable possessions were not heavy. They were repeatable. This is why ritual mattered. Ritual could be performed anywhere. It did not require infrastructure. It preserved identity. A community performing the same ritual in a new place remained itself. This continuity reduced psychological trauma. It allowed people to move without feeling erased. Now consider the role of elders again. Elders remembered previous disruptions. They recognized early signs. They advised restraint or movement. Their authority was experiential, not institutional. This authority disappears when societies prioritize novelty over memory. Ancient cultures balanced innovation with reverence for experience. Modern cultures often invert this. This inversion affects resilience. Now let us examine a specific ancient practice, initiation. Initiation rituals appear across cultures. They mark transition, they test endurance, they isolate the individual briefly, then reintegrate them with new status. These rituals simulate disruption. They prepare individuals psychologically for loss and uncertainty. They teach that identity survives transition. This training mattered during real collapse. Individuals who had undergone symbolic death were less likely to panic during actual loss. This is not mystical. It is psychological conditioning. Modern societies lack equivalent rights. Transition is often unmarked, unacknowledged. This leaves individuals unprepared. Ancient societies understood this vulnerability. They addressed it directly. Now consider how this intersects with prophecy again. Prophecy was often delivered to individuals first, a dream, a vision, an omen noticed personally. The individual decides whether to act. If ignored, consequences follow. If heeded, survival improves. The story spreads afterward. This structure reinforces agency. It tells the listener, you must notice, you must decide. The visitors often appear in these moments. They are encountered individually. They warn, they test, they depart. Their role is catalytic. They do not manage outcomes. They provoke recognition. This reinforces the idea that preparation is personal. Civilization collapses collectively. Survival happens individually. Now bring this forward. Modern audiences often ask whether ancient warnings apply today. This question is misleading. The warnings were never about dates. They were about behaviour. They ask, do you notice patterns? Do you recognise thresholds? Do you prepare mentally for change? These questions are timeless. Now consider how ancient individuals prepared materially. They diversified. They did not rely on single food sources. They spread risk. They moved seasonally. They maintained networks across regions. This flexibility reduced vulnerability. Modern specialization increases efficiency, but also fragility. Ancient individuals accepted lower efficiency in exchange for resilience. This trade-off is rarely discussed, but it mattered. Now return to the emotional dimension. Ancient stories did not promise comfort. They promised continuity. This difference shapes response. Comfort delays action. Continuity motivates adaptation. The visitors in this framing are not saviours. They are reminders that adaptation is possible, that humanity has endured before, that loss does not end meaning. This is why ancient stories often emphasize calm acceptance, not resignation, acceptance without despair. This is difficult to cultivate. It requires trust in continuity beyond immediate structures. Ancient cultures nurtured this trust. They taught children that worlds end and begin. That identity survives transition. That memory outlasts monuments. This teaching reduced fear. Fear paralyzes. Preparedness mobilizes. Now consider the modern individual, bombarded with information, rarely trained in pattern recognition, often dependent on systems. This creates anxiety. Ancient frameworks offered clarity, not certainty, but orientation. Orientation matters. It tells you where you are relative to change. It tells you which way is forward. This is the quiet power of ancient narratives. They do not predict, they orient, and orientation is enough. In the next segment, we will explore how these individual adaptations scale upward, how communities reorganize, how networks replace hierarchies, and how continuity persists even when formal civilization dissolves. Because while survival begins personally, it does not end there. Patterns repeat at every scale, and ancient cultures understood this deeply. When enough individuals adapt quietly, something subtle begins to happen. Communities change shape, not through decree, not through revolution, but through reorientation. Ancient societies did not wait for official collapse to reorganize. They reorganized beneath it. This is another pattern that modern summaries often miss. When we imagine collapse, we imagine a dramatic moment, a fall, an ending. But in the archaeological record, collapse is usually preceded by a long period of quiet decentralization. People stop gathering where they used to. Trade routes thin. Settlements shrink. Authority diffuses. Life continues, but differently. Ancient communities adapted by loosening. They became more modular. Smaller groups formed. Networks replaced hierarchies. This did not happen because people rejected order. It happened because centralized systems became unreliable. Ancient cultures recognized this early. They did not cling to failing structures. They allowed them to fade. This is visible in settlement patterns. Large cities fragment into satellite villages. Trade networks shorten. Local production increases. These changes are not signs of ignorance. They are signs of risk management. Communities spread exposure. They reduce dependency. They trade efficiency for resilience. This trade-off appears repeatedly across periods of stress. Now consider how ancient myths frame this transition. Rarely do gods destroy societies outright. They withdraw. They abandon cities. They remove favour. The result is decay, not annihilation. This framing mirrors lived experience. Cities do not explode. They empty. People leave. Institutions hollow out. The mythic withdrawal of gods reflects social withdrawal. Authority loses coherence. The centre no longer holds. This is where the visitors reappear symbolically. They often arrive after the centre fails. They guide the scattered. They teach new leaders. They establish new norms. This reinforces the idea that they represent reorganisation, not domination. They appear when old structures can no longer function. Now consider how communities preserve cohesion during this phase. They rely on shared practices, ritual meals, seasonal gatherings, marriage networks, storytelling. These practices do not require centralised authority. They operate horizontally. They maintain identity across dispersion. This is critical. Without shared practices, fragmentation becomes isolation. Isolation increases vulnerability. Ancient communities understood this. They preserved social glue even as political structures weakened. This may explain why ancient rituals emphasize participation. Everyone joins, everyone remembers. Memory is communal. Now examine how knowledge circulates in such systems. It becomes redundant. Multiple people carry the same information. No single individual is indispensable. This redundancy increases survival. If one carrier is lost, others remain. This principle appears in oral cultures worldwide. Important stories are known by many. This is not inefficiency, it is resilience. Contrast this with modern specialization. Critical knowledge is often concentrated. Loss becomes catastrophic. Ancient systems avoided this. They distributed memory intentionally. This distribution may explain why ancient warnings persist. They were not stored in one archive. They were embedded everywhere. Now let us return to prophecy again. Prophecy often addresses communities, not states. It warns villages, clans, families. It rarely speaks in bureaucratic language. It uses symbols familiar to daily life. This ensures relevance. Now consider the emotional experience of communal transition. Ancient stories do not glamorize it. They acknowledge grief, loss of home, loss of familiarity, but they also emphasize continuity of belonging. The group survives, even if the place does not. This distinction is crucial. It prevents despair. Despair dissolves communities faster than disaster. Ancient narratives worked against despair. They reframed loss as movement. Now examine how this movement manifests physically. Paths change. Sacred sites shift. Old centres become pilgrimage ruins. New centres emerge quietly. This is not random. It follows resource availability, climate, security, but it is guided by memory. Ancient communities often reoccupied older sites or built near them. This maintained connection to the past. Even when structures changed, this practice creates continuity across ages. Now consider the role of law in this phase. Ancient legal codes often allowed flexibility during crisis, temporary rules, emergency norms, suspension of debts, redistribution of land. These measures reduced internal conflict. They prioritized cohesion. This again reflects expectation of disruption. Law was not absolute. It adapted. Now contrast this with modern rigidity. Systems often resist adaptation. They preserve rules even when conditions change. This increases stress. Ancient societies avoided this trap. They institutionalized flexibility. This is not idealism, it is pragmatism. Now consider how these patterns scale. Individual adaptation leads to community reorganization. Community reorganization leads to cultural transformation. Over time, a new civilization emerges. This emergence is often mistaken for invention, but it is recombination. Old elements rearranged, old knowledge recontextualized. This explains why new civilizations often resemble old ones, not because of copying, but because of inheritance. Now reintroduce the visitors. If such beings existed, their role would likely be catalytic at this level. They would not rule empires. They would influence norms, teach practices, encourage decentralization, then withdraw. This aligns with ancient depictions. They are not kings, they are teachers. Now consider the alternative explanation again. If the visitors are symbolic, they represent the moment communities accept transition. They personify the shift from centralized certainty to distributed resilience. This is a powerful image, and it would explain why the motif appears across cultures. Different names, same function. This does not resolve the question of their reality. It reframes their significance. Whether literal or symbolic, their stories helped communities survive. That alone is remarkable. Now consider how this applies to modern society. As systems grow larger, decentralization becomes more difficult, but not impossible. Networks already exist. Informal communities, shared knowledge spaces, cultural continuity persists beyond institutions. Ancient models suggest that resilience lies there, not in preservation of form, but in preservation of function. Function survives when meaning survives. Meaning survives when it is shared. This is the lesson embedded in ancient cycles. This is why ancient stories emphasize relationships, kinship, reciprocity, mutual obligation. These survive, collapse. Institutions do not. Now ask yourself a final question for this segment. If ancient societies prepared for collapse by training individuals and communities to adapt, what did they believe came after adaptation? Not immediately, but eventually. What kind of world emerges after repeated cycles? This is where the mystery deepens, because ancient texts do not end with recovery. They end with transformation, and transformation implies something new. In the next segment, we will explore what ancient cultures believed emerged after cycles completed, how humanity itself was thought to change, and why this idea remains one of the most unsettling aspects of ancient tradition. When ancient stories speak about what comes after collapse, they do not describe restoration. They describe alteration. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Restoration implies return. Alteration implies difference. Ancient cultures did not expect the next age to resemble the last. They expected humanity itself to be changed by passage through disruption. This belief appears again and again, not as optimism, not as punishment, but as consequence. In Mesopotamian literature, survivors of great upheaval are described as wiser but diminished. They live longer than before, but not as long as their ancestors. They retain memory, but lose proximity to the divine. Something has shifted. In Mesoamerican traditions, each age produces a different kind of human, one made of mud, one of wood, one of maize. Each iteration is more refined, but also more constrained. Progress exists, so does loss. This duality is important. Ancient cultures did not believe cycles improved humanity unconditionally. They believed cycles reconfigured it. Now consider why this idea would emerge. Living through collapse changes behaviour. It reshapes priorities. It alters social norms. Trauma is not erased, it becomes embedded. Ancient societies understood this. They did not romanticize rebirth. They expected scar tissue. This is why post-collapse ages are often described as quieter, less grand, more cautious. The golden ages are always before, never after. This is not nostalgia, it is observation. Large systems require excess. Excess invites fragility. After collapse, systems become leaner, more resilient, but less expansive. Ancient myths reflect this. The gods withdraw. Humanity continues, alone. Now reintroduce the visitors in this context. They rarely remain after cycles complete. They depart. They ascend. They vanish. This suggests their role is transitional. They do not belong to the stabilized world. They appear during instability, then leave. Why? Because their function is no longer needed. This interpretation aligns with both literal and symbolic readings. If literal, they are external agents intervening during thresholds. If symbolic, they represent guidance during uncertainty. In both cases, permanence is not their purpose. This reinforces the idea that cycles are self-correcting. The world does not require constant oversight, only occasional recalibration. Now consider how ancient cultures imagined the altered humanity. They often describe reduced lifespan, reduced power, but increased autonomy. Humans become more independent, more responsible, more accountable. The gods are distant. The visitors are gone. Humanity must govern itself. This is a sobering transition. It suggests maturity through loss. Ancient cultures did not view this as purely negative. They saw it as necessary. Now contrast this with modern expectations. We often imagine progress as accumulation, more power, more capability. Ancient cultures imagined progress as restraint, better balance, less interference. This difference explains why ancient futures feel bleak to modern readers. They are quieter, smaller, less spectacular, but possibly more sustainable. This perspective may reflect lived experience. After collapse, spectacle becomes impossible. Survival demands modesty. Ancient cultures normalized this. They did not aspire to return to former grandeur. They adapted to new limits. Now consider how this worldview shapes ethics. If humanity is altered by cycles, then moral frameworks must adjust. Ancient post-collapse societies often emphasize humility, moderation, reciprocity. These values appear repeatedly, not as idealism, as necessity. Excess invites imbalance. Imbalance invites collapse. The lesson is not subtle. Now consider how this relates to the recurring nature of ancient warnings. They do not urge humanity to prevent cycles. They urge humanity to endure them responsibly. This is a critical distinction. Ancient wisdom does not promise salvation. It promises continuity through change. This may be unsettling, but it is realistic. Now ask why this idea persists. Because it matches experience. Civilizations rise. They fall. Humanity continues, but never unchanged. The visitors, real or symbolic, mark these transitions. They are remembered because they appear at moments when identity itself is renegotiated. This is not coincidence. Now consider the psychological effects of this belief. If collapse alters humanity, then survival carries obligation. Survivors must remember. They must transmit lessons. They become stewards of continuity. This responsibility is heavy. Ancient stories acknowledge this burden. Survivors are rarely celebrated. They are tasked. Noah does not rejoice. He labours. Post-flood figures often receive laws, covenants, restrictions. Freedom is reduced. Responsibility increases. This reflects a worldview where survival is not reward, it is duty. Now examine how this shapes memory. Ancient cultures preserved not just events, but warnings. They encoded limits, Prohibitions, boundaries. These boundaries were not arbitrary. They reflected lessons learned, painfully. Modern readers often interpret these as superstition, but many align with ecological or social constraints. Do not over-harvest. Do not ignore cycles. Do not centralize excessively. Do not forget the past. These warnings persist because they remain relevant. Now consider the possibility that ancient cultures believed humanity itself is cyclical, not just civilizations. Human nature may oscillate between hubris and humility, between expansion and contraction, between forgetting and remembering. The visitors appear when forgetting dominates. They restore memory, then depart. This model does not require external beings. It requires psychological recurrence. Human behaviour repeats. Lessons fade. They must be reintroduced. This explains why ancient myths feel perpetually applicable. They address tendencies, not events. Now ask a final question for this segment. If ancient cultures believed humanity changes after cycles, are we currently living before or after such a change? This question cannot be answered conclusively, but it frames inquiry. It shifts focus from prediction to posture, from fear to responsibility. Ancient wisdom does not ask us to guess the future. It asks us to notice our behaviour, to recognise patterns, to prepare internally for change. This is where ancient narratives remain powerful. They do not dictate outcomes, they guide response. In the next segment, we will examine one final dimension, why ancient cultures believed forgetting was inevitable, and why they embedded reminders not to prevent forgetting, but to ensure rediscovery. Because forgetting, too, was part of the cycle, and rediscovery was never meant to be immediate. Ancient cultures did not fear forgetting as much as we do. This may seem counterintuitive. Modern societies treat forgetting as failure, loss of data, loss of records, loss of continuity. Ancient societies treated forgetting differently. They expected it, not as a flaw, but as a phase. This expectation is woven quietly into their stories. Knowledge is never presented as permanently accessible. It is hidden, buried, sealed, submerged, locked behind riddles. Then, much later, it is found again. This pattern repeats so consistently that it cannot be accidental. Ancient people did not assume wisdom would be carried forward intact. They assumed it would be misplaced, misunderstood, ignored, and then, eventually, rediscovered. This expectation shaped how knowledge was encoded. If information was expected to be forgotten, then preserving it plainly made little sense. Clear instructions would be lost with institutions. Detailed manuals would rot with archives. Instead, ancient cultures preserved triggers, ideas that would reactivate curiosity when rediscovered, fragments that would invite reconstruction, stories that would feel incomplete on purpose. This explains why ancient texts often frustrate modern readers. They hint without explaining. They allude without defining. They provoke without resolving. This is not incompetence, it is design. Ancient knowledge was not meant to be continuously understood. It was meant to be re-understood at the right time, by people who needed it again. This reframes the entire concept of ancient warnings. They were not meant to stop cycles. They were meant to survive them. Forgetting was not a bug. It was a filter. Only ideas strong enough to be rediscovered would persist. This is an uncomfortable idea. It suggests that knowledge cannot be forced forward. It must be encountered. Ancient cultures understood that people ignore warnings until conditions make them relevant. They did not fight this tendency. They worked with it. Now consider how this applies to the idea of the visitors. They are often described as having left knowledge behind, but rarely in usable form. They leave inscriptions, symbols, monuments aligned to the sky, myths embedded in ritual, Why not instructions? Because instructions require context. Symbols endure without context. They wait. This waiting is crucial. Ancient cultures believed that rediscovery required maturity. That understanding arrives only when society is ready. This belief appears explicitly in some traditions. Knowledge is dangerous when misunderstood. Powerful ideas destabilize immature systems. Therefore, forgetting protects both the knowledge and the society. This is not elitism, it is caution. Now consider how rediscovery unfolds. Ancient myths often describe a figure who uncovers something old, a tablet, a ruin, a hidden chamber. This figure is not chosen randomly. They are curious, persistent, willing to question. Rediscovery is not accidental. It is attracted. This motif appears across cultures. The rediscoverer is often marginalized, ignored, ridiculed, until the knowledge proves relevant. This is not narrative drama. It reflects social dynamics. New. Interpretations challenge existing power. They are resisted. Ancient cultures recognized this. They encoded rediscovery as disruptive, not triumphant. Now consider why rediscovery matters more than preservation. Preservation assumes continuity. Rediscovery assumes rupture. Ancient societies assumed rupture. They built for it. This is why so many ancient structures are overbuilt. Massive stones, redundant alignment, durability beyond practical need. They were not building for use. They were building for finding. A ruin that survives invites inquiry. A ruin that crumbles leaves nothing. This is why ancient monuments feel excessive. They were designed to outlast forgetting, not to prevent it. Now consider how this relates to cyclical time. If cycles are long, no society can maintain awareness across them. Forgetting becomes inevitable. The only question is whether rediscovery is possible. Ancient cultures answered yes, but only if memory is seeded properly. This seeding did not require clarity. It required intrigue. This may explain why ancient stories remain compelling. They are unresolved. They provoke questions. They refuse closure. This keeps them